Hi, hi everyone. My name is Luan. Welcome to this joint session, Discourse Unplugged, um, Discourse Unit, and Knowledge, Power, and Identity. We'll have Dr. Christopher Moller presenting and launching his new book. My name is Luan. I'm convening the Discourse Unplugged. It's an open and interdisciplinary research seminar, so everyone can join us. We meet usually monthly, currently online, for discussing discourse analysis, techniques, pieces of data, etc. Everyone is welcome. If you're not in Discourse Unplugged list, you can just send me a message on chat and I can add you if you want. I will also send our website. And this session will be chaired by Ian Parker, who will lead the session. And if you need anything or have Zoom issues, you can also send me a message. I will take care of that here. And hope to see you soon and enjoy. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, thanks, Luan. We're here to listen to Christian Möller. Christian Möller has just written a new book called Food Charity and the Psychologization of Poverty, published by Routledge. So in some ways, this session is also a launch for the book. We're recording this bit of the session where Chris will give a talk for maybe about 40 minutes about the research and also a quite innovative model of discourse analysis, which I think will be very interesting to those of us who are interested in methods. So then we'll close the recording and we'll open up to the discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Chris now, and he'll tell us what this is all about. Foucault in the food bank. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Ian. Thanks for that introduction. And thanks also to Anne for organizing everything today. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm going to be talking for about 40 minutes, like Ian has said, and then hopefully have a bit of discussion as well. So mainly I'm going to be talking about the book, obviously, that's just been published as part of Ian's series in critical psychology, and also the research that the book is based on. And I've got a few slides, mainly pictures, which will hopefully be interesting to look at. A couple of videos as well, just to give you some examples from the research. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the underlying methodology, and some of the debates around discourse and dispositive analysis outside the UK context as well, which will hopefully be of interest. So this is really taking me back quite a bit. So I started the PhD back in 2015, finished in 2019, and even when I was doing the research, so compared to now, things have obviously changed quite a bit, not just with the pandemic, but at the moment you look at the news and if anything, the situation has become even worse in the UK, especially in the context of the pandemic and the impact that's had on households. And it seems like almost there's a new headline every day about the cost of living crisis, the universal credit uplift being taken away again, the overall increase in food bank numbers. So while the context has changed a little bit since I was doing the research, I still think there's some fundamental issues that are not necessarily being addressed in the reporting and in some of the research that's being done today. So hopefully that's not going to be of interest. And there really is a huge body now of research on the drivers of food bank use and the links with austerity, welfare cuts, and all that, and also the experiences of volunteers and so-called clients, so the people who come to the food bank for a food parcel. But even back then, my interest was much more in this whole narrative of emergency response and food banks simply filling new gaps left by the state, seemingly outside of power and often seen as being outside of critique. So in the UK context, the way it's often being talked about is austerity cuts coming in with a coalition government under David Cameron, and then as a result, food banks just popping up everywhere in subsequent years. And so for the PhD, I did interviews and field work into Trust of Trust food banks. So the Trust of Trust is the big national franchise of food banks. But in addition to that, there are independent food banks in the UK, which aren't part of the Trust of Trust. And I also did my research in one of those independent food banks, who've often got their own way of doing things. In addition to that, I did documentary analysis, I did visual analysis of social media data, looking especially at neighborhood food collections, as they're called. So there are food collections in Tesco stores and Tesco supermarkets across the UK. And that's another thing I'm going to be talking about today. So a quick disclaimer here is that although I did draw obviously on quite a broad range of data from these national organizations, there is quite a bit of variation and diversity among the food banks, especially independent food banks, are a really diverse group in the UK. So that's just worth keeping in mind. So in the book, I developed some of those conceptual ideas around materialist approaches to discourse analysis, particularly from German schools of critical discourse analysis, which so far really haven't been getting any attention in psychology. So I'm going to be talking about that a bit, then talking a bit about the food collections and the visual examples from that. And then I'm getting to what's called the more than food approach. So these are different services like budgeting, cooking courses that are being provided by food banks, often in partnership with other agencies and other support services. And then finally, just to offer some reflections, obviously from my own experience, but also to open up a discussion about some of the larger implications. What does it mean to do this type of research? And what's the critical element here, really? And how can it be developed further, really? How can it be of use to other people as well? So just to give you a brief idea where I was coming from when I started the PhD, some of these points I've mentioned already. Back then in 2015, research on food banks in the UK was only just beginning to emerge, whereas now it's quite a saturated field, actually, to say the least. But even then, I was quite amazed and often quite frustrated by the lack of critical engagement with food charity. And most articles and media reporting will often follow the same narrative. So simply saying it's a shame that we need food banks, or simply we shouldn't need food banks. And of course, that implies that they are needed at the moment as a direct consequence of benefit cuts, years of austerity, and so on. And while that's not wrong, of course, I found that extremely limiting. So the sole focus on drivers of food bank use and only studying experiences, because by reducing them to a symptom, we divert attention from what it is that food banks are actually doing, from the discourses that are at work in these spaces. So that was really the focus of my research. And the other point relates to this common acceptance and even endorsement by some leading academics of these add-on or non-food services. And they're often seen as uncritically as just another layer of extra support in addition to providing food. And that's something that's being taken really for granted. And that's why I felt like a critical approach, and especially the tools of critical psychology would really offer a different perspective here. And that's really where the book is coming in, to think about, to think more critically about what is happening at a level of subjectivity when we send people onto budgeting or cooking courses and we turn poverty into a diagnosable condition, something that needs some kind of behavioral treatment. So this one idea of psychologization and how it plays out in a local context. And then there's some methodological issues I'm addressing. If you're familiar with any kind of discourse analysis, and I suspect they'll be fairly familiar. So thinking more critically about some of the problems around realist, really positivistic approaches to studying poverty, and some of the limits really that come with that, also in relation to some of the reform agendas. So to give you a bit more background, really, so when I was starting the PhD in psychology, I didn't have a traditional background in psychology, really. So my first degree was in combined social sciences. Then I went on to do a master's in research methods. And when I got more into psychology, really, a lot of the readings on discourse analysis seemed to follow very similar patterns and maintained quite a narrow focus, I felt, on language use and studying naturalistic data. And at the time, I was, of course, heavily influenced by Ian's and Erica's brilliant books on more critical approaches in discursive psychology, going back to the 90s, some of the more recent books, also by Margaret Weatherwell, some really interesting stuff there, but it was still not quite what I was looking for at the time, I think. And then I became also increasingly concerned by some of the, quite strange attempts, I think, to standardize Foucauldian approaches. So this whole invention of Foucauldian discourse analysis in psychology, in UK psychology at least, seemed quite strange to me at the time, because, well, it was also confusing because at the time, at least in the German discourse literature, in the German literature on Foucault, there was a very clear sense that there's really no such thing as Foucauldian discourse analysis. Foucault had very different definitions and understandings of discourses at different times, and he never provided any methodological guidelines for how to do discourse analysis. So the closest thing to that may have been his Orders of Discourse, lecture or essay. That's something that Derek Cook has pointed out. But of course, that's still very far from providing like an empirical research program. So at that point, I was quite influenced by also Rainer Keller's work, a professor in sociology, who brought together Foucault and the sociology of knowledge and pragmatist sociology, which he then called the sociology of knowledge approach to discourse, which is quite a mouthful. But he also emphasized that the term discourse and its use in sociology really predates Foucault. So it was that dissatisfaction really with the way that discourse analysis was adopted by psychology as yet another empirical text-based method that led me to different German schools of critical discourse analysis, and in particularly KDA, so critical discourse analysis, but the K to really distinguish it from the British counterpart. And the writings by Siegfried Jäger were a major influence here, especially during the first year of the PhD. So he and his wife were based at the Duisburg Institute for language and social research. They're still doing regular workshops on discourse analysis. Very sadly, he passed away in 2020. I never had the opportunity to meet him, sadly, but I feel by reading his books at the time, that was like a major turning point, really, while planning the research as well. And quite a game changer, to be honest. It really changed my understanding of what discourses are and what discourse analysis is capable of, because it really emphasizes the political dimensions of doing discourse research. And that, of course, is in stark contrast to some of the really unpolitical adaptations in discursive psychology in particular. So this whole materialist understanding of discourse is as flows of knowledge which create material realities, for me really gets away from some of these endless debates that seem to be going on between relativism, realism, and discourse research, because discourses are not reducible to language, they form material realities. So it's a materialist form of constructionism, if you will, but it demands some kind of political involvement. And that's, of course, reflected in the work that's still going on in the Institute. So looking at the far right in Germany, and the reporting on the so-called refugee crisis and so on. And so in the last couple of years before his death, Siegfried Jäger turned more towards dispositive analysis as an expansion of discourse analysis. So that's something I want to really propose as a possible way forward. And in my case, bringing together the analysis of visual materials, interviews, and documents from the food banks, I also turned to Foucault's concept of the dispositive as an apparatus or power knowledge regime, whichever way you want to translate it, and the way it's been developed further in some approaches to critical discourse analysis, but also in other fields like education, sociology, and so on. And it extends discourse analysis to address what Keller calls the infrastructures of knowledge production and the symbolic and material resources which enable, support, and normalize discursive practice over time. And there are really two major books here that were a massive influence. So obviously the German book by Andrea Bührmann and Werner Schneider, but also Thomas Lemke's book, which has just been published in English for the first time. And so for Foucault, dispositives included discursive, but also non-discursive practices that he talks about, as well as material objects. And Lemke's book really gives a really good overview of those concepts. And he also distinguishes the term from assemblages and other related terms, and then links that to similar debates and the new materialism and so on. So that's highly recommended reading. And here the strategic element is absolutely key. So dispositives always respond to some urgency or some kind of emergency. Obviously for Foucault, he talked about the prison complex as a dispositive, sexuality as a dispositive at a particular moment in time. They respond to something, to some urgency or emergency. They mobilize a response and put new language, new objects, even feelings at our disposal in response to these problematizations. And what that really does is it moves away from any kind of textual empiricism and any obsession with language use and discourse analysis, because for Foucault, it's of course not about relations of meaning or language, it's about relations of power, and that's what dispositive analysis is all about. So it's not so much a methodology in its own right, but a research perspective and part of a critical ontology. And it's got the added benefit really of letting people untangle, as Bührmann and Schneider call it, the social world with its always specific ways of speaking and acting, its specific symbolic visibilities, as well as material objectifications. So here you've got quite a lot going on. So it's about visibility, it's about material objects as well, so not just human actors. And the question then becomes, how do these discursive and non-discursive practices interact to bring about social realities? How do they become symbolically and materially powerful? And at the same time, what are some of the intended or unintended consequences? And the point of analysis here is really not to simply identify elements of the dispositive to argue over, oh, is that discursive? Is it non-discursive? Is it material? That's really not the point. The point is to examine the relationship between the elements. How are they working together to create certain conditions of possibility, as Foucault called them, for acting, thinking, and feeling? So in summary, dispositive analysis can be seen as a research style characterized by, I quote, a focus on research questions which aim to establish the relationship between discourse, non-discourse, subjectification, and objectification in relation to social change. And that last bit is really important, I think, in relation to social change. And that already is what makes it critical, I would say. So instead of spending too much time on definitions and all that, I think that's enough on methodology for now and theory. I always find it much more useful to actually illustrate some of these conceptual ideas by looking at research examples. And one of those examples is the Tesco food collection that I've mentioned. And I've got a short video just to give you an idea of what the events are about.
We hope you will join us for the next neighbourhood food collection. This December, Tesco stores will be collecting food for Trussell Trust food banks and partner charity FareShare. You can help feed people in your community by picking up one of our shopping lists and donating an item or two in your local store. Tesco will give a 30% cash donation, enabling Trussell Trust food banks to develop their services to help tackle poverty. Remember, every can helps, so join us this Christmas to help stop UK hunger.
Right, so I hope you were able to hear that. So that was a brief introduction to the event. So across the UK, it used to be twice a year. Now they're only doing it once a year, just before Christmas. Volunteers meet in front of the store or inside the store. and ask you to buy an extra item off a shopping list and then donate it to the food bank as you walk out of the store. And what I actually did was, because it wasn't feasible to go to every Tesco store across the UK, what I actually did was collect some of the data that was tweeted by volunteers, also members of the public, especially the images and photos they've posted of the event. So I collected over several collection weekends, over 2,000 images, and then did a visual discourse analysis of that to really look at, well, how is it that poverty is made visible at these events? What are the discourses at work? How are people being positioned? What are the symbolic practices? I'm not going to get into the visual analysis actually, but if anybody's interested in that, on how I analyzed and encoded the images, then it's something we can come back to in the discussion. So really just to give you some impressions, some insights, what it looks like as you walk into the store. So you're being greeted by these collection points really. So you've got volunteers standing there, but also these massive displays and a lot of discursive work obviously going on. So first of all, it's obviously about feeding people, as it said in the video, or helping to feed the community, which already brings with it, I think, quite a remarkable paternalism. So the problem isn't poverty, the problem is hunger and feeding people. But at the same time, there's a whole neighborhood discourse going on. So a certain localism where food is being presented as the solution, drawing on images of extreme hunger, of course, without actually showing it. So hunger and poverty were always absent from the events. There was also a lot of decoration going on. So they were made into festive events, really. So different bunting going on, and sometimes people in costumes and giving out sweets and cake and all sorts of things going on. So being made into a celebration, really. Then on the left, you've got pre-packed family meals. So for £1, you're being asked to buy this mystery bag of food and then drop it off, which is essentially a race to the bottom because it makes feeding as cheap as possible. And at the same time, it takes away the last bit of choice, of course. So the absent poor are there to be fed and must be grateful for whatever we give them, for whatever is in the bag. And of course, as you can see on the right, there are these mountains of Tesco's own brand items. So the collection points themselves are a great opportunity to maximize visibility of their own brands, to increase their sales, of course, to promote their own brand items. And so it's clearly no shortage of food. That's a problem here. So it's clearly the problem is a lack of charitable conduct. And that's what the collection points and the events are about, changing our conduct. You know, they're about making us into contributors, into generous members of our community. And it's worth taking a closer look at some of the displays and discursive materials as well. And again, there's a lot of branding going on. So on the leaflets, on the banners, on the posters, you get, of course, the Tesco logo, the Trust and Trust logo, the Fair Share logo, which are the big food charities, the Everyday Value logo on the Tesco items, on the left, of course. And what's interesting is that the volunteers become indistinguishable from the Tesco team. So even wearing a t-shirt that says Team Tesco, where poverty relief becomes completely commodified, really. So the solution to poverty becomes neatly packaged with a modest price tag. And of course, in return for doing all that, for picking up the leaflet, doing a bit of extra shopping, dropping it off, we are then absolved from any political responsibility, because if every can helps and more is always better, then all we need to do is to donate and to consume more. So there's no need to even see poverty or ask what's causing it or ask who's profiting from it. And like I said, the recipients, so people in poverty, were largely absent from the displays. Where they were visible, like here in the middle, it was usually to give some kind of testimony and some kind of endorsement of the help they've received, to show gratitude for the help they've received, always as the worthy poor, so often as young mothers with children, always quite passive, waiting to be fed, grateful for whatever's given to them, since every can helps, of course. And talking about how they were indebted to the food bank for helping them get back on their feet and change their lives. So it's about resilience and bouncing back from a natural state of crisis. It's not about changing conditions that create poverty. Of course, it's about changing and transforming the person and reintegrating them into life. And within this resilience discourse, poverty then is made into a natural disaster requiring better adaptation and individual preparation for protection for future shocks. And what probably struck me most about the events was the absence of poverty itself and how they were instead made into celebrations of community. And charity was made visible as a positive experience and a source of happiness. And that became very much a recurring theme throughout the research as it went on, because charity provides new experiences to be consumed, and it promises this instant emotional gratification to volunteers. The message is that even by donating, we too can become part of a happy neighborhood where nobody goes hungry. And you may recognize the bald fella in the middle here. That's, of course, Ian Duncan Smith, former Tory leader under austerity and architect of universal credit, who was pictured here posing at a food collection, of course, dropping off some donations and then putting that on social media, which caused a bit of stir in the media at the time. But apart from that, the events themselves really haven't received much attention in the media. And it's really these expectations of positive emotions and gratitude that were also evident across so-called client case studies. So these are the testimonies by clients themselves who had used the food bank. And sometimes they were made visible at the events, but also used across different media, across the websites, where food bank users tell their stories of salvation and being changed by the food bank, learning new skills, overcoming poverty by having the right attitude, or simply taking responsibility again for their lives. And within this happiness discourse, happy selves are resilient, they're inward looking, they're always in motion and constantly adapting to whatever's thrown at them. They never become disruptive or ask who is causing their suffering, because they're always forward looking. And in the book, I link that to the turn from welfare to well-being and the cultural influence of positive psychology, where we constantly have to cultivate positive emotional states, and we're made responsible really for our own well-being. And Sarah Ahmed calls these objects happiness pointers. They are infused with the promise of happiness, right, and positive affect, and to criticize them is to deny happiness, becoming then what she calls affect aliens. And she's also very clear about the consequences and the potential costs by showing that, as she says, happiness can also work to conceal the causes of hurt, or even to make people the cause of their own hurt. So it's not simply about depoliticizing poverty as an issue. Food charity produces new subjectivities, new expectations for how to feel and how to conduct ourselves. And despite these promises of community and happy neighborhoods, separation remains pretty much central, and it's the alpha and the omega of the spectacle, as Didi Ball put it, because the poor are being kept at a comfortable distance from places of consumption, while volunteers act as proxies and pastoral agents for the absent poor. They are the ones receiving gifts and in return consuming the spectacle as we are consumed by it. Visibility is a trap, wants Foucault as well, because if commodification is all that exists, then we no longer see it, just as we stop seeing poverty and only see opportunities for consumption, growth, and maximizing the happiness of some. And in the book, I also go a bit further and argue that this separation is also a defense mechanism against the anxiety of losing our own normality as able consumers, because we're being reminded to be constantly at risk of falling into poverty ourselves and becoming that other, the distant recipient. But as long as we're able to consume and buy some extra items, that other is kept distant and separate from the self at a safe distance, at least for the time being. And just to show that it's not just Tesco who are getting involved in this, there's another short video I'd like to show.
I'm so proud of this partnership, and everyone at ASDA is just really proud of the charities and how far they've come. We're so thankful for our colleagues for getting behind Fight Hunger, Create Change and supporting it, our community champions who are right at the centre of the ASDA communities in the UK, and they are the ones who are collecting the food donations, volunteering at food banks, really connecting community groups on the ground, especially in the last 18 months, and have been the lifeblood of their communities.
ASDA's investment in us has meant that we can put bigger fridges, bigger freezers, larger warehouses, more vans, more forklift trucks, and that means that we can get more meals, more food, to where it's really, really needed. The support from ASDA has literally transformed us. What's been unique about the support we've had from ASDA is the sheer scale of it. The £12 million investment that has gone into FareShare has enabled, across the 4 nations of the UK, all of the FareShare operations to really scale up and increase the number of meals that we are able to supply. But on top of that, a further 6 million meals has been enabled to be redistributed from ASDA stores themselves at the end of the day, with the small amounts of surplus product, with a local charity going and connecting with that store, collecting it and redistributing it there and then. During the pandemic, ASDA support has made a massive difference on 2 levels. First of all, thanks to the capital investment that had gone in, we were ready to be able to redistribute a lot more food. And then secondly, a £5 million, I'd say that again, £5 million investment from ASDA has enabled us to get so many more meals out to families and elderly people in lockdown situations incredibly quickly.
I think there have been two main parts to how the Fight Hunger, Create Change partnership has worked for Trussell Trust. First of all, the funding, £5.8 million worth of grant funding we've been able to provide directly to our food banks to hire specialist advisors around benefits and debt and mental health, so that at that point of crisis for somebody in a food bank, there is specialist support there. But also not just tackling that short-term support. So ASDA have funded State of Hunger research, which is the first study of its kind into the long-term drivers of food bank use in the UK, and it's really helped us to advocate and campaign for long-term solutions that will ultimately end the need for food banks. And ASDA customers as well. The donation points in store are our lifeblood for our food banks. So the volume of food that has been donated by ASDA customers, together with that investment in support services, together with that investment in research into long-term solutions, has been a really crucial, pivotal partnership for us.
It's been a wonderful privilege to be part of Fight Hunger, Create Change, and the work we've done together will continue to have an impact on those communities long into the future. And that's really the magic of Fight Hunger, Create Change.
Right, so quite a lot going on there, obviously. We could probably spend the next hour or so doing a discourse analysis on that video alone, but I'm not going to do that. Just to highlight a couple of points there, I think. So what's quite remarkable, I think, is always talk about investment by ASDA, so bigger fridges, bigger freezers, larger warehouses, more vans, more forklift trucks. So it's clearly about expansion and scaling up the operations, as they put it. So they've been completely captured by this business logic and the demands of the market. So charity is not something that's somehow isolated, opposed to these things. It's very much part of a capitalist economic and symbolic order as well. And then, of course, the Trussell Trust CEO, they're also talking about the Astor money being used to hire more specialist advisors and offer support at the point of crisis. That's something to keep in mind, because I'm getting to that in a second. And then finally, also mentioning that the Astor money funded the State of Hunger report, which was really celebrated as a landmark report last year or the year before that. So Astor money, Astor were owned by Walmart, or were owned by Walmart until recently, funding academic research, which is obviously problematic. So I'll say a bit more about that in a minute as well. And related to that, there are now some very well-established so-called brand partnerships between supermarkets, food companies, and the two big food charities. So often leading up to Christmas, you even get some adverts on TV. If you buy a Christmas turkey at Tesco, they'll donate £1 to the Trussell Trust or Fair Share. Coca-Cola, same thing. So over a period of time, 1p for every bottle sold will be donated, and so on. Washing up liquid, 1 pack equals 1 meal for people in need. You get the idea. So poverty relief itself is being turned into a commodity. And in a German context, Stefan Selke has written extensively about this idea, what he calls the new economy of poverty, where poverty itself becomes a fictitious commodity. And just as we can buy and drop off a £1 family meal bag to become part of that community of givers, we can also do our part by buying the right kind of brand. And I don't think I need to say much probably about Coca-Cola's human rights record. There's some really good work by NGOs just highlighting some of their labor practices, the environmental damage across the globe, their anti-union policies, recent plant closures in the UK and Ireland despite record profits. Kellogg's is another excellent example. So Fair Share seem to be really proud of their partnership with Kellogg's. But then just before Christmas in the US, 1,000 workers for participating in strike action. So obviously these things then aren't being talked about. And of course, the elephant in the room almost is how many supermarket workers end up going to food banks themselves because of low pay and because of these labor practices. And going back to this idea of the dispositive and what's fueling the dispositive as a machine, if you will. So Asda and Morrison's have launched very similar campaigns to other major supermarket chains in the UK, and have also been giving millions of pounds to the biggest food charity. So over £40 million in corporate funding just since the start of the pandemic. That's in addition to the Tesco collections, which are going on anyway. Promising better infrastructure, so some of the stuff we saw in the video, better trucks, providing fresh produce and all this stuff. At the same time, of course, Asda, Tesco being constantly in the press about their labor practices. A couple of years ago, Asda forcing workers to sign punitive work contracts. All these things are still going on. And I think these sorts of materializations, so collection points, the events themselves are really important here, and I think they're a good example of how these discourses of neighborhood and feeding the poor are materialized, how they're brought to life and take on a life of their own often, with a certain normalizing function. And as part of a dispositive, food banks and other institutions, businesses obviously are constantly producing new knowledge of the causes, experiences, and possible solutions to poverty, and with it new, including psychological terms, through which people then understand themselves as subjects. And that often includes neoliberal discourses around development, resilience, and how they're then materialized and put into practice across interventions. And what's often misunderstood, and which I find quite frustrating, to be honest, is that neoliberalism doesn't mean less government. It means different government at a distance through technologies like happiness, community, and so on, as lots of people have shown in the area of governmentality studies. But to add a bit of balance here, to really make clear that these are not deterministic machines. They can only shape the conditions of possibility and try to steer us into desired directions, they don't always achieve the desired effects. Of course, many people will simply walk past the connection point without donating. And even in my interviews, there were examples of managers, at least for a moment, reflecting more critically on their partnerships. The same here. Yeah, it's a great thing, but also a double-edged sword, she was saying, because on the flip side, it really normalizes food bank, and that can potentially become quite dangerous. So that was her words. So she was talking about that normalization that's going on. There were other signs of resistance. One food bank refused to work with the local job center and wouldn't accept referrals from them. And there were some tensions with the local council as well, who had underspent some of the hardship funds, but still kept sending families to the food bank to save on their budget, obviously. So there was some awareness of that, some pushing back. That's important to keep in mind, I think. So volunteers, managers, they were constantly having to negotiate the seemingly unpolitical role of charity as well. So this I'm only going to be touching on quite briefly, but in the book I've got a chapter on this idea of crisis and this construction of clients being in crisis, being in a state of crisis, where I think a bit about the origins of the crisis discourse and the medicalization that's underlying here, really. And as I may have mentioned in the beginning, food banks are often praised for presenting quite a welcoming environment, a friendly space, a caring space, of course, in contrast to the job center and formal welfare settings. So people come in, there's something distinctly British about it, being offered a cup of tea, some biscuits, and yeah, they can have a chat with somebody. I was quite fascinated by this kind of therapeutic setting, because that is, to be fair, very different from other countries. So thinking about the US, Canada, Germany, even, where you've got much more of a transactional model of food aid. So it's much more of a shopping experience, right? People come into the food bank, even if there's limited choice, it's still mainly about going in, getting your food and walking out again. Whereas here, there was clearly something else going on. So when people enter the food bank, even with a voucher from a referral agent, which they need, they're greeted by a volunteer, by a signposting agent, as they're called, being asked to sit down and have a chat and explain what brought them to the food bank, to talk about their crisis, to really constitute themselves as worthy subjects, to have a convincing story to tell as well. And it's really that confessional setup that creates quite a complex power dynamic between a listening volunteer and the speaking recipient as an obedient patient. And I've got an open access paper just on that relationship, thinking about Foucault's writing about the confession, the Christian pastorate, and how that really brings into play this double role that volunteers have. So yes, on one hand, they're absolutely supporting people, right? They might give benefit advice or signpost people onto different services and so on. So they've got this caring role, but at the same time, there's also still the disciplinary element. They have to oversee the food. They've got responsibility for the food. So they have a responsibility to watch over the flock as a whole. They have to reintegrate people, return them to the flock as a shepherd, pretty much. And part of that is of course, rationing food parcels, of saying, you've had so many and so many months, what's happening here? What kind of extra support is necessary? And more generally in the interviews and managers, I was mainly interested in how poverty was talked about by staff, and how it then became a matter for different types of interventions. So on one hand, absolutely, they were talking about structural causes, the impact of universal credit at the time, benefit delays, all this stuff. And especially in recent years, the Trust and Trust has done a lot of advocacy around these things. There's been a lot of rebranding going on in the organization. But interestingly, there was also a lot of talk about clients, so users, living chaotic lives, so having some kind of personal deficits, making the wrong choices, this whole idea of a culture of poverty, living in dirty homes, that sort of stuff. So this idea of being irrational actors, needing some kind of behavioral intervention, some kind of correction really to bring them back onto the right path. So concerns with cleanliness, making themselves presentable for job interviews, all that sort of stuff. And of course, these different problematizations, so these behavioral aspects, then require quite different interventions. So a food parcel might be useful for some of the structural problems, just a benefit delay for a couple of weeks, but any more long-term support became absolutely psychologized. And related to that, what really surprised me was how little food banks are actually about food. There's often this insistence of only providing short-term help, not wanting to replace formal welfare services. And this whole conditionality, so saying, yes, we will help you, but it has to go hand in hand with you getting support from somewhere else. That's not even necessarily a new finding. There's quite a bit on the conditionality of food aid, the whole bureaucracy of having a voucher regime and so on. But what's new here and what really fascinated me was this initial feeding of people really as a first stage of treatment to make them more receptive to behavior change. And often the food parcel was being talked about as just a means to an end to help people to settle down, to take away an immediate worry, but at the same time not give them too much food, because if you give them too much food, then they no longer have the incentive to work on themselves and stay within budget as well. And then, of course, it gets much more disciplinary after the parcel limit has been reached. And then it's at the discretion of the manager to give another parcel. And they would often say, oh, we need to sit down, have a conversation about what's going on, and so on, looking at the budgeting, the personal situation, and so on. So this disciplinary element coming back again and again. Now, if providing emergency food isn't enough, then more than food has been advocated by the Trussell Trust as a seemingly more holistic approach to poverty. And it's also among the services being funded through the Tesco collections, the Asda donations and all that. So more than food really includes cooking and budgeting courses, debt management, that sort of thing. And there's now even a larger trend towards more than food. From a food aid model towards a developmental model. There was quite an influential book in the US really advocating the sort of educational focus to food banks towards development, reintegrating people into the job market and so on. And in my analysis of more than food, I really wasn't interested in the effectiveness of these courses. So I really don't care if it's helping people to, learn some new recipes or anything like that. I was interested in what's actually happening here, what discourses are at work, what's happening at a level of subjectivity. And when you look at some of the quotes, so by people who've done the courses, they talk about changed habits. And now, as I'm saying here, spending less on food, which is some achievement, of course, given the whole cost of living crisis and so on. They're now even making savings and paying off debts. So really presenting themselves as almost the ideal capitalist subject, being completely reformed, repaying debts. What more could you want? At the same time, so it's not just about the skills transfer, but obviously about psychological transformation through some kind of guided self-help culture. So clients first report having some kind of closed mindset, low on confidence, but then suddenly discover new opportunities for growth. They become enterprising selves, better adapting to the shocks of austerity. And that's my final, very short video.
Eat Well Spendless is a 6-week course which aims to help people on low incomes to budget and to cook from scratch. The people who would benefit from an Eat Well Spendless course typically are either people who have been to a food bank directly, or they're people who the food bank works with through referral agencies. So the referral agency would proactively send people to a course hopefully before they fall into a crisis, because we think that prevention is better than cure. There are 2 recipes that people get demonstrated to before they split up and will make the recipe for themselves. We think it's really important that people get hands-on. It's about connecting people with the food, because so often in our society we're just really disconnected from the food, and often people just don't have confidence with food because it's not something they've ever experienced before.
We made different things like soups, pastas, and it was all good stuff every week.
I enjoyed it so much. I'm a people's person anyway, so it's more than I anticipated it to be.
We also focus in each session on a couple of activities which will open discussion based, and these activities focus on things such as planning the menu, planning a household budget, looking at different types of credit, and looking at the Eat Well guidance from the NHS.
It's helped me with budgeting, menu planning, cooking different things.
We're really excited now to bring Eat Well Spendless sessions to places all over the country. Eat Well Spendless is...
Right, so once again, note all the smiling faces, right? These are fun activities and positive experiences, promising instant results. And in the book, I link that to positive psychology, being at work. It's about turning inwards, identifying weaknesses, potentials for optimization, and following expert guidance. And also noteworthy, I think, is the medicalized language that makes poverty into a diagnosable condition. So all these terms being used, prevention, cure, referral, crisis, they're medical terms. And that's where also biopolitical concerns come in, with making people live healthier lives by making the right decisions and learning to live on a low income. So simply learning new adaptation strategies, really. And again, in the interviews, it was really interesting. So the people delivering these courses, taking quite conflicting positions on it, saying on one hand, yes, I wish I could spend the majority of my time doing the courses because you see instant results with people. So clearly it's about changing people, transforming them. But at the same time saying they found it quite hard actually because they found a lot of the people could actually budget far better than she could because they had to, right? So some insight there, I think, into the dilemmas going on, having to negotiate the available knowledge at the time. But generally, the food banks were following a logic of expansion in new networks with agencies, businesses, and one manager even talked about turning it into a purchasable program, which could then be delivered in schools with less food bank talk in it, as she put it. So it's about following market logic and constantly innovating and inventing new products. So I'm coming towards the end. We're a bit over time probably as well. So something that I keep coming back to is really Foucault's notion of critique as an ethical stance and ongoing political work. And that's something I've adopted for the introduction of the book, and thinking of the book as a whole as an essay in refusal. And as Foucault put it, critique as an instrument for those who fight, those who resist and refuse what is, as something that can be used in process of conflict and confrontation, right? So it's not about, for me, filling a gap in evidence, of providing some useful knowledge or anything like that, not even providing a direct insight into the realities of poverty. So there's a different ambition here. And often when talking to other researchers, especially people in social policy, they're often quite surprised that I'm not making any recommendations. I've got nothing to say really about policy reform, partly because that's been done to death, to be honest. I don't think we need another book telling us how bad universal credit is or how bad austerity was, anything like that. So I think the reasons and the drivers are fairly well understood at this point. And what I hope to have shown is that this narrow focus on simply reducing the need for food banks or charity falls just terribly short of the kind of diagnostic work that is required there. And I think we need to refuse this really simplified narrative of a retreating state where charities and food banks are simply responding to gaps or filling existing needs, because that, in a way, essentializes their practices, which are really the outcomes of power. And I mentioned before the strategic concerns in dispositive analysis, and also remember how dispositives react to some social urgency. They bring into play what Foucault called a strategy without strategists. So there's no particular group or class building these things, building these dispositives, but of course they will benefit some groups much more than others, thinking about the business things, obviously. But also they're constantly in motion, they're fragmented, at times contested, as we've also seen, and that can open up spaces for resistance and showing there's really nothing natural or essential about them. And the other point here is really that dispositives aren't just reactive, they create new problematizations. They always find new aspects of a behavior or lifestyle to target. And that's another reason why I think it's so important to include charities and their practices in this critical analysis. They're producers of knowledge and they exercise power. But of course, they themselves are not the target of critique. That's another point that's really important to me. And I've had some positive conversations there as well with managers, volunteers, and that's generally well understood that the target of critique really are these larger discourses and the practices that they enforce and make possible. And finally, then it's about asking what's at stake in the production of new subjectivities and these new ways of feeling and acting about poverty, including as a volunteer, as a donor, and the limits that imposes on our present. And in that, I'm including some ways of resistance as well, because despite all the advocacy work by the food charities, what I found is that they're maintaining quite modest and liberal notions of modest policy reform, tweaking the benefit system a little bit, being a bit nicer to people when we're sanctioning them and so on. And same thing really with rights-based campaign about the right to food and so on. For me, that's still missing the point to an extent. Whereas for Foucault, of course, sort of critical research is supposed to make harder those acts, which are now too easy, as he says. So we need to show how power operates in these spaces. We need to think about who is it that benefits from these things, and also what is at stake. And really just a couple of final reflective points before opening up for discussion, and to counter some of these points I've just made as well, and to maybe make discourse analysis a bit more difficult as well. Just to share some of those personal reflections and some of the points for discussion. So in the last couple of months of writing the book, I came across Bernard Harcourt's work, which really spoke to some of the discomforts and difficulties I was having about being critical and Foucault's notion of critique. And in the book, Harcourt brilliantly describes the development of different schools of critical theory and the turn away from praxis towards what he considers much safer epistemic concerns with the roles and function of knowledge. And he then, of course, advocates a return to the original ambition of transforming the world, not just describing or interpreting it. And I think discourse analysis, particularly in psychology, is a good example of this often distanced, quite safe mode of critique and analysis. Whereas for people like Siegfried Jäger and those doing KDA, it's not just about describing discourses, but becoming involved in discursive struggles by offering new ways of understanding. So it's about disrupting flows of knowledge in order to weaken them so that their power can be weakened in the process. And that can bring back some crucial agency, I think, because discourse is understood also as the support columns of institutions, and they present much more fluid, fragmented, and attackable targets. And in that context, Jäger also kept using the term currently valid knowledge to really emphasize this point and the potential for things to change and to be replaced by something else. And obviously, I'm hoping that the book is one contribution to that. It's definitely not intending to fill a gap, like I said, but to cut through some of that knowledge. And some of that experience I use in my own teaching when I talk about neoliberalism, new localisms, and so on. So it's really about confronting our own practice with critical theory. But at the same time, is that really enough? And I'm asking myself, what more could I be doing? So I've had some really good conversations with people from the independent food aid network, for example, who are much more critical of the corporate links. A lot of the independent food banks, they don't have a referral system. They might not even enforce a parcel limit and so on. They are much more open to change, of course. But overall, that's still something I'm finding quite difficult at times. And of course, recognizing that this type of critique, this type of quite theoretical work is of course going to be very limited use to volunteers, to people who are at the moment risking their health during COVID, maintaining food bank operations, and so on. And kind of linked to that, I'm also often asked why I didn't interview clients themselves, which I hope at this point should be obvious to an extent, because in the book I'm being quite critical of this whole humanist promise of empowerment, which equates speech with freedom, and the naivety that sometimes goes with even well-intentioned qualitative research. And then I give the example of first visiting a food bank and this elderly couple coming in without a valid voucher, being really distressed, looking really anxious, just standing by the door, not wanting to talk to the manager, not wanting to talk to me, and just how inappropriate it would have been to even approach them for an interview. So it's really this question of, well, how do we include perspectives? How do we get to this idea of actual subjectification, but without reproducing these confessional dynamics? And that's something that has been picked up, to be fair, a lot of the feminist, post-humanist scholarship around the ideas of giving voice. So Patti Lather, Elizabeth St. Pierre, Wendy Brown, they've all written about these ideas and the potential also for resistance in silences and refusing to give an account of ourselves. And then finally, really as a final point, is the whole question of value, where it's very much influenced by the work of Johannes Möller and his idea of discursive capital. Because what we have at the moment really is a research landscape and a situation where studies into food bank use, into poverty, are commissioned and funded by the Trussell Trust, often with generous funding from the likes of Asda, as we have seen. And well, I'm just asking myself, how can that ever be disruptive if we've got these major multinational corporations funding poverty research? So is it any wonder that we keep hearing the same stories over and over again? And that also raises the difficult question about reflexivity and the value of academic knowledge that we produce. And people, I think, at times becoming complicit in what Andy Fisher has called the hunger industrial complex. So this increasingly dense network between large food charities, food companies, supermarkets, but also academic knowledge, evidently, because a lot of this knowledge that's being produced, a lot of the data that's being produced is enormously useful to the charities for their fundraising, for their marketing activities, and so on. And of course, that's eagerly taken up by the charities and is in turn fueling the dispositive even further. So I've put down a couple of questions for reflection, this idea around confessions, the personal involvement in these discourses, and the question of value. And I'm going to leave it there, but I'd be really keen to hear any comments, thoughts about the research, about the method as well. So I'm going to give over to Ian again.